everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Erica with Memory Box Candle Co. and I make videos all about making and selling candles. And I apologize that this video is coming out so late, but I swear that February has been the busiest month ever. We've had so many things going on. We've gone out of town, we've had birthdays, we've had anniversaries, we're preparing for our wedding, and it just, everything YouTube and everything work has just been kind of all over the place this month, so I apologize. However, the good thing with that is that my candles really got a good amount of time to cure before I actually tested them. So I think they were around 3 weeks before I actually ended up testing them. And if you have not seen part 1 already, I highly recommend that you go check that out before watching this video. I will have that linked right above so you can check that out. But I just tested the EC26 wax, which is also called the Virgin Coconut Soy Wax. And I tested it in my Cali jars. So the 13.5 ounce Cali jars with a 3.25 inch diameter. And I double wicked it with 3 different wicks. And I honestly thought that I ruined this whole testing process because the very first burn test that I did, I had to leave the house after 2 hours. And I think that that's something that if you're a candle maker, you know that you do want to try to get that 4-hour burn test result. Luckily, because it is a halfway fill of the jar test, so I filled it halfway, so it's going to burn much faster, much hotter, so I don't have to worry about it, you know, tunneling or not really reaching the sides at that point, because after 2 hours, they were all already at full melt. So I didn't feel that bad, but it was really interesting and I still did want to share the results with you. Also, don't mind me, I am going to be looking at my iPad throughout this, just as I put up the footage right here. That's the only way that I really knew how to make this kind of, you know, work together at the same time. So what I did was I went through and I just trimmed the wicks on all of them. So I trimmed them down to about 1/4 inch before lighting it for the first burn. And the main thing that I noticed was that the Eco 1 wicks already after lighting it was kind of a little chaotic just after like a minute of lighting it. So I already kind of had a feeling that the Eco 1s were going to burn too hot, but I wanted to test it anyways. But after about a half an hour, I checked it and both the CDN wicks, so the CDN 2s and the CDN 3s, were not yet at full melt. They still had some hang up on the side, whereas the Eco 1 wicks, you can tell that it was burning much hotter and that it was almost already at about 1/4 inch of a melt pool. After an hour, both the flames on the CDN series wicks were still relatively small and they were almost at full melt. There were still hang up on the side at the bottom, whereas on the Eco 1s, it definitely was, again, already at full melt and the flames were very, very hot and kind of going a little crazy. And then by hour 2, right before I blew out all the candles because I needed to leave, I did observe all of them, and I did notice that by now the CDN series wicks were at full melt at about 1/4 inch, and then the Eco 1 wicks were definitely burning very hot, and I was noticing a lot more mushrooming on the tops of the Eco 1 wicks as well. And then a couple days later, I did a second burn test and I wanted to make sure I could get the full 4 hours this time. So what I did was I went through and I kind of observed all the tops of the wicks. And really on the CDN series wicks, there was a very, very small amount of carbon buildup, like a very small amount. So all I did was just trimmed off a little bit of the top of those ones. And then on the Eco 1s, I did notice more of a mushroom on top. So I trimmed that one as well. And then I relit them and then checked them after about 45 minutes. So after the 45 minutes, what I observed was that the Eco 1 wicks definitely looked like they were burning hot as usual, and they were already it was already pretty much at a full melt, so about 1/4 inch. However, on the CDN 2 wicks as well as the CDN 3 wicks, on one side it hadn't completely melted down yet, so it wasn't at full melt quite yet. And then it took another about 45 minutes or so for it to reach full melt on the CDN series wicks. And then I recorded it after 4 hours so you could see what it really looked like. So the Eco 1 wicks, you can tell right away, it is burning just way too hot. You can already see down at the bottom of the metal wick showing, and it is just burning way too hot. There's just too much room right there for it to for it to be burning that hot to where you can actually see down at the bottom. The melt pool is just getting way too deep. And I checked the temperature, and the outside of the jar was 162 degrees. So that really, you know, I mean, it's getting up there. The standard is for the ASTM candle safety standard, you want to keep the jar temperature below 175 degrees Fahrenheit, but you really want to try to keep it at the lower end if you can, and knowing that it will just keep burning hotter and hotter as it goes lower in the jar. I just knew right away that the Eco ones were just burning way too hot. And then you can kind of see the same thing with the CDN3 wicks as well. So it doesn't show as clearly down at the bottom to the metal wick holders as much as the Eco 1 series does, but you can definitely tell that you can start to see it as well, and it is burning quite hot. And I measured the outside of the jar temperature, and that was around 160 degrees. So that also was burning quite hot. And then when you get to the CDN2 wicks, this is where it's kind of hard because you can't see down at the bottom like you can on the other one. So it's definitely not burning as hot as the other ones. The outside jar temperature was about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is why I would definitely want to do maybe some further testing on this one. But honestly, my gut instinct is that the CDN2 wicks are still too big for this container. And that is something that I've, you know, learned a lot with double wick testing with my own candles using Soy 10, is that I was not able to find a single wick or a double wick that worked in the jars that I wanted to use without having to blend waxes, without having to blend in some beeswax into my Soy 10 to bring up that melt point of the total wax. And that is why it's hard, and that's why I really wanted to see if I could find something. Now, what I am interested in doing is trying out different series of wicks. So what I decided to do after this was go on to the Facebook group, that For the Love of Coconut Wax Facebook group, and just kind of do some research. And I highly recommend for you to do this as well. If you don't know where to start with the jar diameter that you're using, the kind of wax you want to work with, I highly recommend that you go on there and kind of look at the files tab. So they have some really, really helpful information about wicking and just general candle testing, safety, and all of the standards that you need to abide by. So throughout this process, technically, all of these wicks passed according to the ASTM standard in just this burn test. So all of these passed, and let me actually read you what you need to make sure of when you are doing the burn test according to the ASTM standards. So you have to make sure that the flame height is no bigger than 3 inches, which none of those flames even got close to 3 inches. You have to make sure that the container is intact, not cracked or broken. There is no cracking, no breaking of the glass. Black smoke isn't excessively streaming from the wick. That didn't happen from any of them. The container hasn't damaged the surface it's sitting on. There was no damage to the table that the candles were sitting on, and the candle hasn't tipped over or spilled, and that did not happen. So technically, according to the candle safety standards from the ASTM, all of these passed. However, in my experience, knowing how the candles are, knowing how some people may burn candles without trimming the wicks, you do have to kind of think, okay, well, I want to make sure that this candle is going to perform as well as possible. And especially when you are double wicking, you have to make sure that you are not making the candle to where it's going to burn too hot. That's why doing a burn test halfway is really, really important, just so you can see how well the candle is actually performing at the second half of the jar. I also know that double wicking and single wicking, there's kind of some different rules that apply there. So I've been hearing a bunch of different things, but from what I've known in my experience is I want to make sure that when I am doing the second half jar test, that after 2 hours, there is some sort of a full melt or almost a full melt, because I don't want the candle to be burning so cool so that as it starts to burn down lower in the jar, it's just gonna go out, which I have personally made candles like that and sold candles like that before and have received that feedback. And then I had to adjust my, my candle recipe and say, okay, well, I need to not add in as much beeswax because it's cooling down the candle too much, and the wicks that I'm using are not strong enough to be able to melt it as it gets lower in the candle. So as much as I strive to not get that full melt in that first burn, I also don't want it to get to the point where after the third or fourth burn, the candle wicks are just going out because it's not able to be strong enough to pull down the wax on the sides of the jar and be able to get that even burn as it burns lower in the jar. So I hope that makes sense. I am constantly learning, and I think that the more that I test with a bunch of different waxes, just the more that I'm gonna be learning. So I hope that this video was helpful for all of you. I did actually go online and I ordered some LX series wicks, as well as some zinc wicks. So I really am interested in testing out a single wick in this jar with this wax because I've never done that before. I just immediately jumped to the double wicks because that's what I'm familiar with, but I would be really interested to see how the single wicks perform as well. If you use this wax, the EC26 wax, let's start a thread, talk about your experience with it, the diameter of your jar, what percentage of fragrance oil you personally use, and what wick series has worked well for you. Oh, and one last thing I wanted to mention in this video that I honestly should have done during my wick testing. I've just done it with fragrance oil for so long that it's hard to kind of adjust and do wick testing without fragrance oil, but that's what Kevin from Armitage Candle Company recommends, so that you can get your base wick, and then once you have your base wick, then you're able to add fragrance oil to it and then kind of see how the fragrance oil affects everything, and if you need to go up with your wick. So if you're using a heavier fragrance oil, you may need to go up with the wick size in order to accommodate for that heavier fragrance oil. And I think that is a good way to do it. I just have always done it, you want to make sure that all variables are the same. And no matter what, I guess, in the situation of using a fragrance oil versus using no fragrance oil, as long as you're keeping it the same, you're going to end up with a more accurate scientific experiment results. But I think that that is a good way to do it as well, is to get your base wick and then be able to kind of move on from there. But that is all that I wanted to talk about in this video, as I just ramble on and on about everything. But anyways, go ahead and leave any comments, questions, anything in the comment section below. Talk about your experience using the EC26 wax. And with that, I think I'm going to end today's video right here. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to leave it a big thumbs up, as well as subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.